You can take the ranch if you want, I told my son, dabbing the corner of my lip with a napkin as if it were nothing more than spilled coffee. He froze for half a second, surprised by how easily I gave in, and then I saw it, the relief, the quiet satisfaction, the belief that he had finally won. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even look at Rebecca standing behind him with her arms folded like she had been waiting for this moment for years. I simply turned, walked to the kitchen sink, and rinsed the porcelain cup I'd been holding before everything shifted. The house was quiet in that strange way it gets when something important has just been decided, even if only one side understands the truth of it. For over 40 years this ranch had been my life. Every fence post, every acre of dry grass stretching beyond the barn, every creak in the wooden floors carried a memory of the man I built it with. We didn't have much when we started. Just a pickup truck, a borrowed trailer, and a stubborn belief that we could make something last. And we did. We built something that outlived him. That was supposed to be enough. Daniel used to run across these fields as a boy, chasing after the horses with a laugh that echoed all the way to the hills. Back then he never asked who owned the land. He only knew it was home. But somewhere along the years that changed. The calls became shorter. The visits became rare. And when he did come, it wasn't to sit on the porch or ask about the crops. It was to ask questions. Careful ones at first. About documents. About property lines. About what would happen one day. Rebecca never asked directly. She didn't need to. She would stand just behind him, listening, watching, the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. I noticed it all. I just didn't say anything. That morning, when they showed up with papers neatly clipped together, I already knew what they wanted before Daniel even opened his mouth. He spoke like he was explaining something reasonable, something practical, something for my own good. He talked about maintenance, about costs, about how I shouldn't have to handle all this alone anymore. I let him finish. Let Rebecca add her quiet agreement. And then I said no. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just one word, steady and calm. That was the moment everything shifted. Not into chaos, not into shouting, but into something colder. Something final. And now, standing at my sink, drying my hands on a faded dish towel, I realized something even clearer than before. They thought this was about land. About money. About who had the right to sign a piece of paper. They thought I had just given up. I glanced out the window toward the pasture, where the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the ground. It looked exactly the same as it always had. Quiet. Still. Unchanged. I allowed myself a small, almost invisible smile, because the truth was I hadn't lost anything at all. I had simply decided it was time to let them believe I had. I did not sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because something inside me had finally gone quiet in a way I had not felt in years, like a storm that had been circling finally decided to settle into a clear, cold sky. The house felt different after they left, not empty but exposed, as if the walls themselves had heard everything and were waiting to see what I would do next. I moved through the room slowly, turning off lights, straightening chairs, wiping down the same kitchen counter I had cleaned every night for decades, my hands following habits my mind no longer questioned. Daniel used to sit at that counter as a boy, swinging his legs, asking endless questions about everything he did not understand yet. Back then, he trusted me to have the answers. Somewhere along the way, that trust had turned into something else, something sharper, something that measured value instead of meaning. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the small wooden table by the window, the one my husband had built the year we finished paying off the land. He said every home needed a place where decisions were made quietly. I had not understood what he meant at the time. Now I did. I sat there for a long time, watching the outline of the barn fade into the darkness, thinking about the way Daniel had spoken earlier that day. Not angry, not even impatient, just certain. Certain that he already owned something that had never truly been his. That kind of certainty does not come from nowhere. It is built. Slowly. Carefully. Encouraged. I thought about Rebecca and the way she never interrupted him. Never needed to. How her silence seemed to guide the direction of every conversation without ever taking responsibility for it. She had been doing that for years. I saw it now, piece by piece, like a pattern I had ignored because it was easier to believe in something simpler. I finished my water, set the glass down, and stood up with a decision already formed before I gave it a name. The next morning, I left the ranch before sunrise. The air was cool, the kind that settles over open land before the heat rises, and the gravel road sounded louder than usual beneath my tires as I drove into town. I had made that drive countless times, usually for groceries or supplies, but this time felt different, not because of where I was going but because of why. The bank opened at 9, but I arrived early and sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the front doors as if they might tell me something before I stepped inside. My husband used to handle most of these things. Not because I could not, but because he said it was easier that way. One less thing for me to worry about. I used to believe that meant there was nothing I needed to know. Now I understood it meant there were things I needed to remember. When I finally walked in, the air conditioning hit me first, sharp and clean, a contrast to the dust and sun I was used to. The young man at the front desk greeted me politely, unaware that anything about this morning was different from any other. I gave my name steady and clear, and asked to review the documents tied to the property. He nodded, typed something into his computer, and then hesitated for just a moment before looking back at me with a different kind of attention. It was subtle, but I recognized it. That moment when someone realizes there is more to a situation than they expected. He asked me to wait while he retrieved the records, and as I sat there, hands folded in my lap, I felt something settle deeper inside me, not anger, not fear, but clarity. Whatever Daniel thought he had secured yesterday, whatever Rebecca believed she had quietly guided into place, it was built on assumptions they had never bothered to question. And assumptions I had learned over a lifetime were the easiest things to take away. The young man returned with a folder that looked too thin to hold something as large as a lifetime, but he carried it carefully, like it mattered more than it appeared, and when he placed it in front of me, he did not slide it across the desk right away. He paused, as if waiting for confirmation that I understood what I had asked for, and I gave him a small nod, the kind that says I have been ready longer than you think. He opened it and turned it toward me, pointing to a series of documents that I recognized only in pieces, my name appearing more often than I remembered, signatures that were mine but attached to moments I had long since filed away as routine, harmless, unimportant. He began explaining in a steady, professional tone, but I only needed a few words before the rest fell into place on its own. The property was not structured the way Daniel believed. It never had been. Years ago, my husband had set it up through a trust, something he handled quietly, something he had mentioned only once in passing, saying it was just a way to keep things simple in the future. I had not asked questions then. I was asking them now, but I did not need many answers. The ranch, the land, the accounts tied to it, they were not something that could be transferred with a single signature or a single conversation at a kitchen table. They were layered, protected, arranged in a way that required more than assumption and confidence to control. The young man pointed out specific clauses, terms that sounded technical but carried a meaning I understood clearly enough. Final authority rested with me. Not shared. Not assumed. Not passed down by expectation. Mine. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting that settle, not as a surprise, but as confirmation of something I had begun to suspect the night before. My husband had not left things unfinished. He had simply left them quiet. I asked a few questions, careful, measured, nothing that would suggest urgency or alarm, and the young man answered each one with the same polite precision, unaware that every word was shifting the ground beneath a situation he could not see. When I closed the folder, I did it gently, the same way I had closed cupboards and drawers in that house for years, not out of habit but out of control. I thanked him, stood up, and walked out of the bank with the folder tucked under my arm, the morning sun already higher in the sky, warming the pavement in a way that felt almost out of place with the clarity settling inside me. The drive back to the ranch felt shorter, not because the distance had changed, but because I was no longer carrying the same questions I had brought with me. The fields stretched out on either side of the road, dry and familiar, and for the first time in a long while, I saw them not as something that might be taken from me, but as something that had never left my control at all. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's truck was not there, but Rebecca's car was, parked slightly off to the side like she had arrived early and was waiting for something. I turned off the engine and sat for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, considering the timing of it, the way things rarely happen by coincidence when people believe they are close to getting what they want. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the house at the same steady pace I always had, not faster, not slower, the screen door creaking softly as I opened it. Rebecca was in the kitchen, standing exactly where I had been the day before, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, but her eyes moved quickly when she saw me, searching for something in my face, something that would tell her how much I knew. I gave her nothing. I set my purse down, placed the folder on the counter beside it, and reached for the kettle as if the only thing that mattered in that moment was whether or not I felt like making tea. She asked how my morning had been, her voice light, casual, the way people speak when they are trying to sound unaffected, and I answered just as simply, quiet, productive. That was all. I could feel her watching me, waiting for more, waiting for a reaction that would confirm the version of events she and Daniel had already decided was true. I did not give it to her. Instead, I filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and turned the knob with a soft click, the flame catching instantly beneath it. There is a certain kind of power in not explaining yourself, in letting other people continue believing what they need to believe for just a little longer. I rested my hands on the counter and looked out the window toward the pasture again, the same view, the same stillness, but now it felt different in a way I did not need to name. Behind me, I heard Rebecca shift her weight, the faint sound of uncertainty beginning to replace the quiet confidence she had carried into the room. I did not turn around. I did not need to, because for the first time since all of this began, I understood exactly where I stood, and more importantly, I understood exactly where they did not. The kettle began to hum softly behind me, the sound low and steady, filling the space between us without demanding attention, and I let it sit there, building, the way tension does when no one speaks first. Rebecca finally moved closer, her footsteps careful against the wood floor, stopping just short of the counter as if there were an invisible line she did not want to cross yet. She asked if I had given any more thought to the paperwork, her tone still light, but thinner now, stretched over something less certain than before. I reached for a cup, placing it on the counter with a quiet click, then another. Setting them side by side like this was nothing more than an ordinary afternoon. I told her I had thought about it, which was true, but I did not offer anything beyond that. People expect explanations when they believe they are in control. Silence unsettles them in a way arguments never can. She waited, and when I did not continue, she filled the space herself, mentioning deadlines, opportunities, the importance of timing, each word chosen carefully, as if she were guiding me toward a conclusion I had already refused to reach. I listened without interrupting, not because I agreed but because I wanted to hear how far she was willing to go when she believed I was no longer resisting. There is a point where persuasion turns into pressure, and pressure reveals intent more clearly than any confession. The kettle clicked off, and I poured the water slowly, watching the steam rise, letting the moment stretch just a little longer before I spoke again. I told her I would sign when everything was ready, that I did not want to rush into anything without understanding it fully. The words were simple, harmless even, but I saw the shift in her expression immediately, the way her shoulders eased, the way her eyes softened with something that looked almost like relief. That was all she needed to hear. Not the truth, just enough to confirm what she already believed. She thanked me, too quickly, then turned slightly toward the doorway as if she were already planning what came next. I picked up my cup and took a small sip, the heat grounding familiar, unchanged. From the window, I could see the fence line stretching out toward the far end of the property, posts spaced evenly the way my husband had insisted they should be, straight, measured, deliberate. He used to say that if you built something properly the first time, you would not have to fix it later. I wondered if he knew even then that this would be the part one needed to understand most. Rebecca asked if I wanted Daniel to come by later to go over the details, her voice steadier now, more confident, and I nodded without hesitation. Of course, I said, as if there were nothing unusual about any of this. As if yesterday had not happened. As if I had not spent the morning sitting across from a stranger who had quietly confirmed that everything they were building their plans on was incomplete. She smiled then, a small, controlled expression that did not quite reach her eyes, and stepped away from the counter, already pulling her phone from her pocket. I did not need to hear the conversation to know what she would say. That I had agreed. That things were moving forward. That everything was finally falling into place. I set my cup down and reached for the folder, opening it just enough to see the top page. My name printed clearly where it had always been, steady, unchanged, unaffected by the assumptions that had grown around it. I closed it again and rested my hand over it for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. This was not about proving them wrong. It was about letting them continue long enough to understand exactly how wrong they had been. Outside, the wind moved lightly across the dry grass, bending it just enough to show direction without causing damage. I watched it for a second, then turned back toward the stove, rinsing the cup and placing it carefully in the rack, the same way I always had. Behind me, Rebecca's voice carried faintly as she stepped outside to make her call, the tone bright, assured, already certain of an outcome that had not yet been tested. I let her have that certainty, for now, because certainty, when it is built on the wrong foundation, does not need to be challenged. It only needs time. Daniel arrived just before sunset, the sound of his truck rolling over the gravel carrying farther than usual, like the land itself was paying attention, and I stood at the window for a moment before turning away, giving myself just enough time to settle into the same quiet rhythm I had held all day. He walked in without knocking the way he always had, but there was a difference now, something in the way he paused just inside the doorway, as if he were measuring the space differently, not as a home but as something already half his. Rebecca followed a step behind, her expression composed, her movements precise, and she gave me a small smile that felt more like confirmation than greeting. I motioned toward the table, already set with 3 chairs, and they both sat down across from me, close enough to appear united, far enough to leave a space between us that no one acknowledged. Daniel placed the folder on the table, a different one than mine, thicker, more deliberate, and he began explaining the terms again, slower this time, as if repetition would make them easier to accept. He spoke about efficiency, about future plans, about how this was the best path forward for everyone involved, each sentence carefully constructed to sound reasonable, inevitable. I listened the same way I had listened earlier, without interruption, without reaction, letting him build the version of reality he needed to believe. Rebecca added small details, clarifying numbers, timelines, legal steps, her voice steady and confident, the kind of confidence that comes from thinking all variables have already been accounted for. When they finished, Daniel slid the pen across the table toward me, not forcefully, not impatiently, just certain. I picked it up, turning it once between my fingers, the weight familiar, the gesture simple, and for a brief moment, the room went completely still. I could feel both of them watching, waiting for that final confirmation, that last step that would turn everything from expectation into fact. I lowered the pen to the paper and let it rest there, just touching the surface, not moving yet, giving them exactly what they needed to see. Then I signed. Not quickly, not hesitantly, just steadily, the same way I had signed my name on countless documents over the years, each letter deliberate, unchanged. When I finished, I set the pen down and slid the paper back toward Daniel, meeting his eyes for the first time since he arrived. He exhaled, a small release of tension he probably did not realize he had been holding, and Rebecca's posture shifted beside him, subtle but unmistakable, like something had just settled into place. They thanked me, both of them, their voices overlapping slightly, already moving forward in their minds to whatever came next, whatever plans they had been holding just beyond reach until this moment. I nodded once, nothing more, and stood up, gathering the cups from earlier as if this were nothing more than the end of an ordinary conversation. Daniel began talking again, something about contacting the broker, about scheduling the next steps. His voice lighter now, almost relieved, and Rebecca was already pulling out her phone, likely sending a message to confirm that things had gone exactly as expected. I carried the cups to the sink, rinsing them under warm water, the sound steady, grounding, unchanged, and as I placed them in the rack, I allowed myself one quiet thought, clear and complete. They believed the signature had given them control. They believed the decision had been made. They believed the outcome was already theirs. I dried my hands slowly, turning off the faucet with the same care I had used all day, and looked out the window once more at the stretch of land beyond the fence. Nothing out there had changed. Not the soil. Not the boundaries. Not the truth of who it belonged to. Behind me, Daniel's voice carried on, confident, assured, already moving ahead, and Rebecca's tone matched it, calm and certain. The two of them building something on top of a foundation they had never actually examined. I did not correct them. I did not stop them. I simply let them continue, because some lessons are not learned through words or warnings. Some lessons require a person to walk all the way to the edge of what they think they own before they understand where they truly stand. And I was prepared to let them walk as far as they needed to. The next few days moved with a strange kind of calm, the kind that feels almost rehearsed, as if everyone was playing their part in a scene they believed had already been decided, and I let that calm settle into the house without disturbing it. Daniel called twice the following morning, his voice lighter than it had been in weeks, talking about next steps, about meetings, about how quickly things were moving now that everything was taken care of. And I listened the same way I always had, offering simple answers, short confirmations, nothing that would slow him down or make him question the path he thought he was on. Rebecca stopped by again that afternoon, carrying a folder of her own, filled with printed emails and notes, her movements efficient, purposeful, as if she were already managing something that belonged to her. She spoke about timelines, about interested buyers, about numbers that sounded large enough to impress but small enough to sound realistic, and I nodded where it seemed appropriate, letting her build the structure she needed around something she did not fully understand. There is a certain confidence people carry when they believe the most important decision has already been made, when they think the hardest part is behind them, and I could see it clearly in both of them now, the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they no longer watched me as closely as they had before. That was the first shift. They stopped paying attention. I spent that afternoon the same way I always had, walking the perimeter of the property, checking the fence line, letting my hand rest briefly on each post as I passed, the wood warm under the sun, steady, unchanged. The land did not respond to paperwork or conversations. It responded to care, to time, to the quiet consistency of someone who understood what it required. As I walked, I thought about the documents I had seen at the bank, the structure my husband had put in place, the layers that existed beneath the surface of what Daniel and Rebecca believed they were controlling. They had seen a signature and assumed it was the final step. They had not asked what came before it. That evening I made a call of my own. Not long, not complicated, just a quiet conversation with someone who understood the language Daniel and Rebecca were trying to use, someone who could move through it without announcing it. I gave my name, confirmed a few details, and asked for a review of the trust, the accounts, the authority attached to them. The man on the other end spoke calmly, professionally, asking precise questions, and when I answered I could hear the shift in his tone, the same recognition I had seen at the bank, the understanding that what appeared simple was not. He told me he would prepare everything, that there were steps to take, safeguards to confirm, and I thanked him without urgency, because urgency was not necessary. Everything that mattered had already been set in motion long before Daniel placed that pen in front of me. The following day, Daniel sent a message about a meeting with a broker, something scheduled for later in the week, and he asked if I wanted to attend. I read the message twice, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to understand how certain he had become, how far he had already stepped into a future he believed was secure. I replied that I would be there. That was all. No questions. No hesitation. Just agreement. When you allow someone to move forward without resistance, they rarely stop to check if the ground beneath them is stable. Rebecca called shortly after, her voice bright, almost excited, talking about how everything was coming together, how this was the right decision, how it would be better for everyone in the long run. I let her speak the same way I had before, giving her the space to confirm her own expectations, to reinforce the version of events she needed to believe. When she finished, I thanked her for keeping things organized, and I could hear the satisfaction in her response, the quiet pride of someone who believes they have managed something successfully. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the same counter, the same window, the same stretch of land beyond it, and I felt no urgency, no pressure, no need to act quickly. Control does not require speed. It requires patience. And patience, I had learned, is something most people give up long before they realize they need it. Outside, the wind moved again across the field, the same steady motion as before, bending the grass just enough to show direction without breaking it, and I watched it for a moment before turning away, already knowing what would happen next, not because I had forced it, but because I had allowed everything to move exactly as it needed to, right up to the point where it could no longer hold itself together. The morning of the meeting arrived with a kind of stillness that felt deliberate, as if even the air had decided not to interfere with what was about to unfold, and I dressed the same way I always did when something mattered, not for appearance but for clarity, choosing a simple blouse, pressing the fabric flat with my hands, smoothing out anything that might distract from what needed to be done. The drive into town was quiet, the road stretching out in long, familiar lines, each mile passing without resistance, and I noticed how steady my hands were on the wheel, how even my breathing had become, not because I was calm in the way people expect, but because I was certain in a way that does not require emotion. When I arrived, Daniel was already there, standing outside the office building with Rebecca beside him, both of them dressed with the kind of care that suggests they are stepping into something important, something they have already imagined the outcome of. Daniel waved when he saw me, a quick, confident motion, and I returned it with a small nod, nothing more. Inside, the office was bright, clean, the kind of place designed to make decisions feel official, permanent, and the man who greeted us introduced himself with a firm handshake and a practiced smile, speaking in terms that carried both reassurance and expectation. We were led into a conference room, a long table at the center, documents already arranged in neat stacks, pens placed precisely where they would be needed, everything prepared in advance as if the outcome had already been confirmed. Daniel sat across from me, Rebecca beside him, their chairs angled slightly toward each other, a quiet alignment that said more than their words ever would. The man began outlining the process, speaking about offers, timelines, legal transitions, each step laid out clearly, efficiently, and I listened without interruption, the same way I had listened to Daniel, to Rebecca, to every version of this plan that had been presented to me over the past few days. There is a rhythm to these conversations, a structure that builds toward a single point, and I could feel it now, the way each sentence moved us closer to something they believed was already decided. At one point, Daniel leaned forward, resting his hands on the table, his voice steady as he confirmed that everything was in place, that the property was ready to move forward, that there were no remaining obstacles. I watched him as he spoke, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet recognition, the understanding that he had stepped so fully into this version of reality that he no longer saw the edges of it. Rebecca added a few details, clarifying figures, referencing communications, her tone confident, controlled, and the man across from us nodded along, satisfied, already moving into the next stage of explanation. Then he turned to me. He asked if I had any questions, his voice polite, neutral, the same tone he would use with anyone in my position, and for a moment the room became still again, the way it had before, waiting, expecting. I folded my hands lightly on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath my fingers, grounding myself in something real, something unchanged, and I looked at the documents in front of me, the neat lines of text, the spaces marked for signatures, the careful structure of something that appeared complete. I said that I did have one question, just one, and all three of them shifted slightly, not noticeably, but enough for me to see it, the subtle tightening of attention, the brief pause before something they had not planned for. I asked the man to confirm in simple terms who currently held final authority over the property, not who expected to, not who intended to, but who legally, definitively, held that authority at this exact moment. He blinked once, just once, then reached for the documents, flipping through them with a precision that suggested he had done this many times before, but this time there was a hesitation, a slight delay as he reviewed the details more carefully. Daniel shifted in his seat, a small movement, almost imperceptible, and Rebecca's posture stiffened just enough to register. The man cleared his throat softly, then began to explain, his tone still professional, but now more measured, more exact, and as he spoke, I did not look at the papers, I did not look at the table, I looked at Daniel, watching as the certainty in his expression began to adjust, just slightly at first, then more noticeably as each word settled into place. I had not raised my voice. I had not argued. I had not interrupted their plan. I had simply asked a question, and sometimes that is all it takes to begin unraveling something that was never as solid as it appeared. The man's voice continued, careful now, precise in a way that removed any room for interpretation, and as he explained the structure of the trust, the chain of authority, and the conditions required for any transfer to be valid, the room shifted in a way that could not be undone. He said that while documents could be prepared and intentions could be stated, the legal authority had never left my name, and without my direct, fully informed approval under the correct conditions, nothing could be finalized, nothing could move forward in the way that had been described. There was a pause after that, not long but heavy enough to settle over the table like something tangible, and I could feel Daniel's attention turn toward me, not with confidence this time, but with something closer to uncertainty, the kind that appears when a person realizes they may have misunderstood something important. Rebecca spoke first, her voice steady but tighter than before, asking for clarification, referencing the document I had signed, pointing out that it should have been sufficient, that it had been reviewed, that everything had been agreed upon. The man nodded, acknowledging her point, but did not change his explanation. He said that the document, as it stood, did not override the existing structure, that it was incomplete without additional steps, additional confirmations, and most importantly, additional consent that had not been properly established. I watched Rebecca as he spoke, the way her expression held for a moment before adjusting, recalculating, searching for another angle, another interpretation that would bring things back into alignment. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his hands no longer resting confidently on the table, his posture shifting in small ways that revealed more than any words he might have chosen. He asked a question then, direct, simple, asking what exactly needed to be done to move forward, and the man answered just as directly, outlining a process that was slower, more deliberate, and entirely dependent on my continued involvement and approval at each stage. I did not interrupt. I did not correct. I let the information settle the way it needed to, piece by piece, until the version of certainty they had built began to lose its shape. There is a moment when realization does not arrive all at once, but instead moves through a person gradually, like light shifting across a surface, revealing details that were always there but never fully seen. I could see that moment now, in the way Daniel's gaze moved from the documents to me, then back again, as if he were trying to reconcile two versions of the same situation that no longer matched. Rebecca's silence was different this time, not controlled, not guiding, but waiting, calculating, the space between her words no longer working in her favor. The man across from us asked if we would like to proceed with the necessary steps, his tone neutral, offering a path forward without assuming it would be taken, and Daniel hesitated, just briefly, before looking at me again, as if waiting for something, a confirmation, a direction, anything that would restore the clarity he had carried into the room. I met his gaze, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the same calm I had held from the beginning, and I said that I would need time to review everything properly, that I would not be moving forward with any decisions today. The words were simple, measured, final in a way that did not require emphasis. Rebecca opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, the argument forming and dissolving before it could fully take shape. Daniel nodded slowly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, the kind that comes when there is no immediate alternative. The meeting ended shortly after that, the documents remaining on the table, untouched, incomplete, and as we stood to leave, the man gathered them carefully, his expression returning to its original professionalism, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Outside, the air felt different, sharper, clearer, and Daniel walked a few steps ahead before stopping, turning back toward me with a question that he did not quite ask, something held in the space between us that neither of us needed to put into words yet. Rebecca stood beside him, her composure returning in pieces, her mind already moving, already adjusting, but the certainty she had carried into the building was no longer intact. I looked past them both for a moment toward the street, the steady flow of cars, the ordinary movement of a world that did not pause for anyone's plans, and then I brought my attention back to them, knowing that whatever came next would not need to be forced. It would unfold on its own, just as everything else had, because the truth, once revealed, does not require effort to maintain. It simply remains, waiting for those who tried to ignore it to finally understand what it means. The drive back from the meeting was quieter than any road I had taken in years, not because there was less noise, but because there was nothing left to question, and that kind of clarity changes the way everything sounds. Daniel followed behind me for a while, his truck visible in the rearview mirror, keeping a steady distance as if he had not yet decided whether to close it or fall back, and I let him stay there, neither slowing down nor speeding up, giving him the same space I had given him all along. When we reached the ranch, I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine, the familiar silence settling around me like it always had, unchanged, patient, waiting. Daniel parked a few moments later and stepped out, closing his door more carefully than usual, his movements no longer carrying the same certainty he had walked in with earlier that morning. Rebecca remained in the passenger seat for a second longer before joining him, her posture composed but tighter now, her attention shifting between him and me as if trying to read something that was no longer being offered. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the house without rushing, the gravel crunching beneath my feet, each step steady, measured, and I could hear them following behind me, not as confidently as before, but not yet fully uncertain either. Inside, the air felt the same as it always did, warm, familiar, grounded in something that had never depended on their plans, and I set my keys down on the counter before turning to face them. For a moment no one spoke. Daniel looked at me directly, searching, as if trying to find the version of me he had understood before, the one who would either agree or resist in ways he could respond to. That version was no longer there. He asked, finally, what this meant, his voice quieter than it had been in days, not confrontational, not demanding, just uncertain. I considered the question, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted him to hear it in a way that did not leave room for interpretation. I told him that it meant nothing had changed about the ownership of the ranch, that the structure in place had always been the same, and that any decision regarding it would require more than assumption and preparation. Rebecca stepped forward slightly, her voice controlled, asking why I had not said anything earlier, why I had allowed things to move this far, and I looked at her for a moment before answering. I said that I had been listening, that I had wanted to understand what they believed, how certain they were, and what they were willing to do with that certainty. There was no accusation in my voice, no anger, just a statement of fact, and that seemed to unsettle her more than any argument could have. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the room before stopping near the window, looking out at the same stretch of land that had been there long before any of this began. He asked if I had intended to stop everything from the beginning, and I told him no, that I had intended to make sure everything was done correctly, that nothing would be rushed or misunderstood, because once something like this is moved, it cannot be undone. He turned back toward me then, something in his expression shifting again, not fully understanding, but beginning to see that the outcome he had assumed was never guaranteed. Rebecca remained still, her silence returning, but different now, no longer guiding, no longer controlling, just present, waiting for something that was no longer coming. I walked to the window and rested my hand lightly against the frame, looking out over the pasture, the fence line stretching out exactly as it always had, steady, unbroken, and I spoke without turning back. I said that I had not stopped them because I did not need to, that everything they had planned had been built on something incomplete, and that sometimes the only way for a person to understand that is to let them carry it as far as they can. The room was quiet again after that, the kind of quiet that does not need to be filled, and I let it remain because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to argue. The truth had already done its work, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly enough that it could not be ignored. Behind me, I could hear Daniel shift his weight, the subtle sound of someone adjusting to something they had not expected, and Rebecca's breath, measured, controlled, but no longer steady in the way it had been before. I did not turn around. I did not need to see their faces to know what had changed, because for the first time since this began, they were no longer moving forward. They were standing still, trying to understand how they had gotten there, and more importantly, how they had misunderstood everything along the way.